Hello, my name is Jeffrey and I'm a professor of history at Queen's University in Canada. And I'm going to offer you a series of short talks covering the political theory of Thomas Hobbes. We'll begin with some comments about Hobbes' life and times. And the first thing to say about the life of Thomas Hobbes is that it was extremely long. Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada, and he died in 1679, late in the reign of the Stuart King Charles II. He never had children, he never married, he was from a modest social background. He supported himself, as most intellectuals of the 17th century did, through patronage, the patronage of powerful aristocrats. Hobbes attended Oxford, and he rather hacked his way through the traditional scholastic curriculum of Oxford in his day. His primary intellectual pursuit was Greek and Latin literature and language. He was part of the humanist movement of this period. He was a student of antiquity. His first publication was an English translation of the Greek historian Thucydides. Now, later in his life, Hobbes would make a great show of repudiating the wisdom of antiquity in favor of new science. But he always remained, in some sense, the erudite humanist. Late in his life, he would return to the translation of ancient texts, to the translations of Homer and Virgil. So Hobbes remained attached to the problems and texts of antiquity. His interest in humanist letters, in some sense, explains his own rhetorical style and his own brilliant written style. So one context for understanding Hobbes is humanism. Another is science, or the new science, what we call the new science, what Hobbes would have understood as the new natural philosophy of the 17th century. My talks are mostly going to deal with Hobbes' account of political theory, but with Hobbes you can't understand political theory unless you understand the nature of humans. And you can't understand the nature of humans unless you understand the nature of matter. So he was not a narrow political theorist in our sense, he was a broad philosophical system builder. All knowledge was scientific to Hobbes, including political knowledge. Now, as a young man, Hobbes served as a kind of secretary to Francis Bacon, the great methodologist of science. When he was abroad, he met Galileo. He wrote texts opposing some of the theories of the great René Descartes. So there are many points of entry for Hobbes into the culture of the new science of the 17th century. He claimed himself that it was mathematics that provided him a model of philosophical reasoning. Euclidean geometry, to be precise. And indeed, this was an era in which philosophy itself was becoming mathematized, if you will. What do I mean by that? Ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, understood the world as a world of discrete things perceivable by our senses, each with their own essence, and each having their own purpose. The virtue of a thing were those qualities which allowed it to realize its ultimate purpose. So the virtue of a red ball might be its bounciness and its roundness. The virtue of a soldier might be his courage. The world of discrete things, perceivable by our senses, objectively understood by our senses, was swept away by the new scientists of the 17th century, partly because they had skepticism about the reliability of our senses. They thought that most qualities that we perceived in the world were subjective. They were merely sensory perceptions of our own bodies. They weren't necessarily inherent in the things themselves that we were perceiving. They did not understand the world as a world of essences, of things with individual qualities. Instead, they tended to understand the world as a world of undifferentiated matter, atomic matter, matter in motion. The world was, in that sense, something to be understood quantitatively, not qualitatively. Hobbes participated in this move against scholasticism, and his own version of the mechanistic universe was particularly radical. Whereas Descartes had preserved a realm of spirit, of non-material things like God and the soul, Hobbes swept that aside entirely. To Hobbes, nothing non-material existed. Everything was matter in motion, and this included human beings, and this included human minds, and human souls, and even God himself. The human mind and the human will were governed by the laws of matter, in other words. Hobbes denied, in a sense, the traditional understanding of free will, whereby the will or the reason can transcend material causes or material necessity. To Hobbes, the will was merely the last appetite or aversion of a material being, of a material mind. Humans are driven, in this sense, by their appetites and wants. This was radical stuff, and most of Hobbes' contemporaries viewed this version of the new science as fundamentally atheistic and immoral. But Hobbes' materialism was, and his materialist understanding of humans, was in his mind a necessary consequence of the new science. And this understanding of humans as matter in motion was foundational to his politics. And that is why Leviathan, his great masterpiece, which we often think of as a work of political theory, begins with large sections on the nature of matter and on the nature of human beings as material objects, as material beings. So in the coming talks, we'll turn our attention more directly to Hobbes' political theory. But here we have laid out two contexts in which to understand him. One, humanism. And Hobbes did maintain an interest in many of the political questions of antiquity, such as the balance of reason and rhetoric in human affairs, or the role of glory in political life, or the relative value of monarchical and republican constitutions. On the other hand, as a participant in the new science, Hobbes repudiated much of the wisdom of antiquity, particularly its natural philosophy, and embraced the new mechanism, the new materialism of the scientific culture of the 17th century. And most crucially, he understood human beings as part of that mechanistic materialism, as part of the new scientific understanding of the world. He understood humans and their minds and their will as matter in motion.